Hello there and welcome. My name is Alexander and you're listening to another realization. I wanted to make this video to address the general mindset behind the concept of fighting for freedom. For many people view themselves as being freedom fighters without actually knowing what it truly means. And this is mostly geared towards political activists and people who engage in various political endeavors in an attempt to convince the people in government to give the people their freedom back. However, it shows a profound misunderstanding of what freedom actually is and what message the political activists are actually sending to those they are trying to convince. To ask for something is to accept that the decision is the other person's to make. To ask those in government for a bit more freedom is to admit that it is up to them whether the people may be free or not. In other words, to ask for freedom is not to be free, but to accept one's subjugation to someone else. Consider what an oxymoron it is for a person to claim to have an unalienable right to do something and then to ask the politicians for their legislative permission to do that thing. The belief in authority ultimately leads even those who imagine themselves to be ardent pro-freedom advocates to condone their own subjugation, no matter how loudly they demand that the politicians change some law. Those who claim to love freedom while still suffering from the authority superstition merely reinforce the legitimacy of the ruling class's control over them, by implicitly agreeing that the people need the ruling class's legislative permission in order to have the right to do anything. When activists try to convince politicians to repeal some law, those activists are implicitly admitting that they need permission from their masters in order to be free. And the man who runs for office, promising to fight for the people, is also implying that it is up to those in government to decide what the peasants will be allowed to do. As Daniel Webster put it, there are men in all ages who mean to govern well, but they mean to govern. They promise to be good masters, but they mean to be masters. Activists spend huge amounts of time, money and effort begging their masters to change their commands. This shows that, regardless of their displeasure with those in power, they still believe in the myth of authority and will cooperate with legal injustice unless and until they can convince the masters to change the rules, to legalize justice. The truth is, one who seeks to achieve freedom by petitioning those in power to give it to him has already failed, regardless of the response. To beg for the blessing of authority is to accept that the choice is the master's alone to make, which means that the person is already, by definition, a slave. One who begs for lower taxes is implicitly agreeing that it is up to the politicians how much a man may keep of what he has earned. One who begs the politicians not to disarm him via gun control is by doing so conceding that it is up to the master whether to let the man be armed or not. In fact, those who lobby for politicians to respect any of the people's unalienable rights do not believe in unalienable rights at all. Rights which require government approval are not unalienable and are not even rights. They are privileges, granted or withheld at the whim of the master. And those who hold positions of power know that they have nothing to fear from people who do nothing but pathetically beg for freedom and justice. However loudly the dissenters talk about demanding their rights, the message they actually send is this: we agree, master, that it is up to you what we may and may not do. Those in government derive all of their power from the fact that their subjects imagine them to have power. Nothing better shows the power of the belief in authority than the spectacle of millions of people begging a few hundred politicians for lower taxes. If the people truly understood that the fruits of a man's labour are his own, they would never engage in such lunacy. They would simply stop surrendering their property to those who claim to own them. What's the point of unalienable rights if you agree with the idea that those rights come from governments, from mere human beings? And inevitable is the case that such rights can also be taken away by the government. Because if you think rights come from human beings, then it logically follows that rights can also be taken away by human beings. And some of you might rightfully disagree and say, well, they don't come from governments, they are inherent to my existence. Well, in that case, why don't you just defend them then? If rights don't come from mere human beings, regardless of what title they wear, then why don't you just disobey the laws that transgress upon your supposed unalienable rights to do so anyway? If you say that your rights are inherent, then this group of people who calls itself governments is just another gang of aggressors, like any other thief who forces you to do something you'd rather choose not to do. How would you react against that? I bet you'd certainly defend yourself against the thief or any other private thug, or at least you wouldn't hesitate about the idea of defending yourself against them. But in the case of the same human beings that behave in the exact same way, who threaten you with violence, take your money without your consent, and impose their will on you, and thus making them a violent aggressor, like any other criminal, there seems to be this reluctance to forcibly resist that group of aggressors when they transgress upon your unalienable rights. It's almost as if people look at those in positions of government as a whole nother entity that is exempt from the ordinary ramifications of the actions of every other human being, and that they are not to be disobeyed or forcibly resisted no matter what. Doesn't it at all occur to you that that's the exact mentality they want you to be in? How glad a criminal would be! Not only do his victims refuse to forcibly defend themselves against his aggression, but they also think that it's morally wrong to resist his aggression. And hence every criminal can get away with anything if they only sit on the position of authority that the rest will perceive him as. Now, who do you think is going to be the most determined to get his hands on such a position? People who live and let live? Or immoral, callous individuals who want to control the lives of other people and get away with it? And you still think that it's wrong to forcibly resist the people who sit on the position of authority? I understand the mindset of those who attend protests for the sole purpose of reaching people, getting together and meeting new people. And I am a proponent of that. I don't intend to discourage people who attend protests for the sole purpose of getting together. But there are those who still fervently believe that after decades of them stomping on you and showing how much contempt they have for you and your so-called unalienable rights, that they still believe that they will listen to you. But at the end of the day, what are you going to achieve if you beg the masters to change the plan? Hasn't it at all occurred to you that nobody ever asked you for your permission to be part of someone else's plan that he will aggressively impose on you? Has anybody ever asked you, do you even want someone else to be in charge of your life? Do you want someone else to forcibly take your money every month without your consent? Do you even want to pay for whatever it is they force you to pay for? Nobody ever asked you for your permission. The only choice they gave you is which master do you want stomping on you and controlling your choices and taking your money? Has it ever occurred to you that you should be in charge of your own choices? That nobody else can force you to make a decision that you don't want to make? And we call that coercion, by the way, something you are not allowed to do as a single individual. But do you agree that they are allowed to coerce people? That if you don't let them take whatever they want to take from you, or when you choose not to make a decision that they want you to make, but you don't want to make, that they are allowed to hurt you and steal from you? Again, something you are not allowed to do as a single individual: stealing and assaulting. Do you agree that they have the right to do things you don't have the right to do, such as trespassing, murdering, assaulting, and kidnapping? And if so, how did they acquire such a right? If there is a conflict between your own conscience and the demands of a politician, do you think that you should ignore your own conscience in order to obey the law? In other words, when a person who is elected as the ruler of other people tells you to do something that you know is wrong, what is ultimately the right choice? Your own conscience or the law, the demand of a politician? So what do you seek to achieve by attending that protest, or by signing that petition, or voting for that politician? If your answer is to change or repeal some legislation that government recently passed, I don't think that sounds very accurate, because if you're truly free, why don't you just disobey and ignore it? Why do you have to stand there with signs and shout for a long time? Why do you need someone else's permission to not have your unalienable rights violated? You might say, well, because they have to change it, we're not the lawmakers. Okay, so the decision is theirs to make then. It is up to them whether you're free to do something or not. It is up to them whether you're free or not. Well, no. Okay, so what happens if they don't repeal it? Or don't change what you want them to change? Will you just go home and obey, like every time they tread on your rights, and accept that the master has spoken, and therefore you are not to be free? And every time they transgress upon your right to do something, you just let them do it? Imagine a bunch of slaves on a plantation, and the master decided that the slaves will be whipped 7 times a day from now on, when previously it was only 2 whips a day. All the slaves gathered together in front of the house of the slave master and demanded an immediate decrease in the number of daily whippings. And suppose the slave master refused to succumb to the demands of his slaves and sent his henchmen to beat them out of his front yard. And the slaves just continue to obey their master, receiving more whippings than usual, and accepting that the master has spoken. Yeah, but you cannot compare our situation to slavery and whipping. Okay, well, suppose the slave master did not whip his slaves, and did not take all of the fruits of their labor, but just took 75%, and let the slaves keep the remaining 25%. What if he took 50%? Is it still slavery? What if he only took 25%? What if he said that he would use it for the good of the slaves and protect the people by equipping his own henchmen with the adequate firepower to control his subjects in order to keep the peace? Well, is it really slavery then? Oh yes, it is. Because it's still up to the slave master how much a slave can keep of the fruits of his own labor. And it's still up to the slave master how free he can be. He still owns you, and you still need his permission. If you were truly free, if you truly owned yourself, only you could decide what you spend your resources on. The truth is, one cannot believe in authority and be free, because accepting the myth of government is accepting one's own obligation to obey a master, which means accepting one's own enslavement. Sadly, many people believe that begging the master, via political action, is all they can do, so they forever engage in rituals which only legitimize the slave-master relationship, instead of simply disobeying the tyrants. The idea of disobeying authority, breaking the law and being criminals is more disturbing to most people than actually being a slave of someone else. Now let me tell you something. Freedom is and always has been illegal. During the era of slavery, the people who helped slaves escape the master were doing something that was against the law. They were doing something illegal. They were criminals. When people were hiding Jews during the reign of the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, they were doing something that was against the law. They were doing something illegal. They were criminals. When the American colonists refused to hand over their firearms to the British Crown during the American Revolution and had a violent insurrection, they were breaking the law. Every single time in history, the fight for freedom was always against the law. The victims of oppression who stood up against the oppression were always criminals. And I know how uncomfortable those words might sound to you right now. Breaking the law, doing something illegal, being criminals. But at the end of the day, do you still believe that when wrongful behavior is made into a law, when stealing is turned into taxation and confiscation, when kidnapping is called arresting, when threats are called fines, and when they call you a criminal or call you out for doing something illegal when you fail to let them do what they want to do with you, do you still think that you are actually in the wrong for doing what is right, even if it is against their law? You see, the word illegal is actually pretty funny. In fact, if we break it down, it becomes very telling. Ill as in compromised, and eagle as in the eagle, the symbol of freedom. Together it says compromised freedom. Coincidence? Intentional? Synchronistic? Whatever you might think, it is the truth. Do not associate legal with what's moral. Something that is legal is something that you have been granted permission to do, which can change at some point, when the politicians decide that you're not permitted to do that thing anymore. A true unalienable right is something everyone has, and can never be taken away from you, and is something that you never need anyone's permission to do. And if someone transgresses upon that right that you know you have, even if in the name of law, don't be afraid to just break the law and defend your right to be free. Please share this video so that it can reach a lot more people. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.